r/ask Reddit. What are some awful things from the 70s, 80s, and 90s everyone seems to not talk about? Pollution. The smog was right shit everywhere in the summer. The cars smelled like raw fuel. The rivers were dirty. Real ducking dirty. Like peel the paint off your house dirty. Poison everywhere. Shit like DDT. They would spray it everywhere. I didn't see a large bird of prey until I was 20 years old. Now I see eagles and hawks every day. And people littered everywhere in the 70s. Cigarette butts everywhere. I remember that especially because it apparently didn't even count as littering to a lot of people who might have at least thought twice about throwing, say, a plastic bag on the street. I still see a few cigarette butts on the street these days, but there is literally no comparison. My parents like to go on and on about how violent things are nowadays and how men would fight honorably and shake hands afterwards instead of shooting or stabbing each other. But the data shows violent crime peaked here in like 1978, the exact time period they remember for being so wholesome. So I don't know what the duck they're talking about. Your parents were probably living a quiet life in the suburbs while most violent crime happened in the more urban areas. NYC had something like 1,800 homicides alone in 1980. NYC made Gary, Indiana look like Duck in Kansas. I can remember being on a scene working a shooting Vic and this guy casually walking up and dumping his gun out between me and my partner's heads. He dropped the gun and poof disappeared into the Bronx River crowd. I had powder burns on my cheek and ear. At one point we would bang 3 homicides a day. It lasted like 24 days. The cops were afraid to ride the subways. It was bedlam. More people died in car accidents before improved safety features, airbags, and stricter traffic laws. From 1979 to 2005, the number of car accident deaths per capita decreased by 35%. So many people didn't wear seatbelts. It just wasn't a thing. I did a posting on this a long time ago, but up until the mid-1980s child abuse, child molestation was simply not talked about at all. Seldom were people prosecuted. No one talked about it. It was socially unacceptable to bring things like that up, and no one wanted to hear about it. So at least in the first half of your time period, OP, it's that child abuse and the like was still out of control and nothing was done about it. In the late 1980s my wife testified to her father's sexual abuse during the custody hearing when her parents divorced. The judge looked at her, 14-15, was an early goth, and told the court he was ignoring her testimony because she was obviously on drugs. As a result, the abuse continued until she was 17. The Rwandan massacre, where during that period, about 12% of the total population of Rwanda was murdered, and the world, on the whole, never even realized what was going on in that country. Plus, if we're including the 70s, the Cambodian genocide by the Khmer Rouge is still rather unknown in the US. 25% of the population dead, and yet Pol Pot lived until 1998. The real, visceral fear of nuclear war. Before the Cold War ended, I had such bad anxiety about that as a teenager that it would cause me to throw up. In the 90s, there was a good chance that your stereo would literally destroy the cassette tapes you put in it. They were never cheap cassette tapes, either. They were the ones you just bought. Imagine if every time you played an MP3 from your phone there was a 1/15 chance the MP3 would disintegrate. Harvest Gold and Avocado Green kitchens. I saw a house for rent on Craigslist that had bathrooms with olive green carpet. I lived in Idaho for a couple years, and a lot of the houses had carpeted bathrooms and kitchens. As a kid I thought it was so cool. As an adult, it was absolutely bizarre and disgusting. Second-hand smoke. I was a youngster in the 70s and 80s and people smoked all over the damn place. My brothers and I would be trapped in the car with my dad chain smoking on the 6-hour drive to my grandparents for Christmas every year. The only places you couldn't smoke were on the bus and at the movies. Where I live, smoking wasn't completely banned in restaurants and bars until the late 90s. There were a few years around then that I hardly ever ate out. I couldn't enjoy my food because of the smoke. AIDS. A few comments are saying how everyone talks about AIDS nowadays, so it doesn't count for this thread. It was really different back then though, in a way that no one talks about much. I'm talking about how it was in America anyway. So many people here are now obsessed with 90s nostalgia, but don't remember or mention how terrifying the AIDS epidemic was. I lost my uncle to AIDS in the early 90s. I remember being in the hospital to visit him with my mom, and the doctor told us how wonderful it was that my mom was there for her brother. The doctor said that the vast majority of the AIDS patients he'd seen had been completely abandoned and shunned by their families. These were mostly young people, dying alone because the stigma and fear was so strong. It sucked tremendously. My uncle was amazing and brilliant and hilarious. He would have loved Reddit. There was also the fear. AIDS was a death sentence, and if you tested positive for HIV you were as good as dead. When we heard Magic Johnson had HIV, child me just assumed he would be dead soon. And then no one truly understood the ways it was contagious. He has HIV? Don't touch him. You'll get the AIDS. The Bosnian Civil War conflict in the Balkans. Even the Rwandan genocide doesn't get mentioned very often today, though people still remember it happened. A lot of people don't remember that NATO was bombing Kosovo when Harris and Klebold shot up Columbine. I've never met an American my age, 20s, who was taught about any armed conflict or genocide in the 90s as part of the standard state, public school, curriculum. The stuff that happened when we were children. We stopped at the civil rights movement and Vietnam. I don't think our textbooks were new enough 15 years old to contain the info either. So that might be part of the reason. I spoke to my students today about how lucky they are to be able to stream music, as I downloaded 5 millibars songs with a 56k modem on Napster. I also boasted that a 30-minute download for one song was considered an extremely fortunate run, in that there was a decent chance your download might not even be the song you wanted. I saw the moment in my students' eyes when I became their equivalent of Grandpa Simpson. I am 34 years old. I downloaded Morrowind over the course of 3 days. I then burned it on a disk, which took another hour. I was so proud that it worked though. The troubles in Ireland are rarely talked about. Ireland was basically a war zone in some parts for quite a while. I remember first hearing about the troubles in a movie and I was like, that's a funny name for a World War II battle. Then someone was kind enough to point out that it was still going on mid-90s. Then it was more like, that's a really dismissive name for a 30-year civil war. Early 90s racial tensions were wild. The OJ documentary did a great job of covering some of it. Statutory rape via rock stars and celebrities in general is a big one. The way Native American children in Canada and the US were taken from their families and placed in schools where they were beaten, sexually abused, and punished for showing any signs of their heritage or culture. Also in the late 90s, Democrats passed child welfare laws that allowed CPS to take children from reservations at caseworker discretion, removing the court aspect that is required for all other children. You are supposed to need a judge for this. These policies are still in place in some states, like California, to this day. The whole satanic panic. People had their lives ruined in these modern witch hunts. Dungeons and Dragons got through it. The Thalidomide disaster is one of the darkest episodes in pharmaceutical research history. The drug was marketed as a mild sleeping pill safe even for pregnant women. However, it caused thousands of babies worldwide to be born with malformed limbs. AIDS in the 80s and early 90s. I was a little kid during the era, being born in 1985, and some of my earliest memories are of people talking about it and how they didn't care what the TV said. Nobody I knew would have touched anything a person with AIDS had also touched. The paranoia was terrifying. I remember meeting one of my mother's friends who had the disease and he seemed normal. I hugged him and everybody made a big deal about how brave it was for me to do that. Such a dark time. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge killing fields in Cambodia. 30% of people were tortured to death and killed with medieval weapons. Absolutely horrific. How girls were viewed. 70s. When I was at school, girls were not allowed to wear trousers. We did cookery while boys did woodwork and tech drawing. Women were not allowed to fill in their own tax returns. Had to be their husband. Margaret Thatcher changed this. Even 10 years later in the 80s, I was turned down at a job interview and the feedback was it was because I was wearing trousers. The US installing puppet regimes ran by brutal dictators in Central America, the effects of which are still being deeply felt today. Whoa. You made it to the end, you're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.